So yeah, the biggest takeaway is it's actually really hard to engage with local authorities. That's what we discovered. But there were interesting solutions around. I think someone proposed having like open days where all the potential suppliers can come in and like a demo. But then the person that was chairing the meeting mentioned like a very interesting difficulty, because even in those situations, the big companies tend to kind of swamp or like take the oxygen out of the room, and there's not much left for small companies. So that's a risk. So maybe working around a better way to get small companies exposed to I don't know, maybe make certain events more exclusive for small companies. If local councils are really sincere in their intentions to work with SMEs, would be a nice way to do it. So yeah, I think that was a very practical takeaway amid like more general discussions.
Hi, I'm Ravi Gogner from BAE. We talked about, this was a while ago. We talked about GDPR, and we were talking about kind of subject access requests as a specific example of where technology might be able to be helpful. We quickly realised that technology is probably not the problem. The process is, the understanding is, kind of common parlance, common terminology about what it means to talk about data security. Willful misinterpretation of those terms is sometimes used as a blocker to get things done. And a really interesting point that was made about the fact that if you take subject access requests as a specific problem, subject access request comes in, the response is distributed amongst 10 or 20 data systems. So 10 or 20 data owners each get a small amount of pain, and it's not big enough for them to do anything about it. Whereas actually in totality, it's a huge problem. So if you had that all centralized, you could realize very quickly that it is a huge problem. What else did we talk about? We talked about the fact that... Pardon?
Cost as well distributed. So
yes.
The cost might be to each department £20, but actually to 20 departments it's a lot more, but the cost is hidden, right? And it's harder to come in and say we can save you all this money, because they're not actually aware of actually the money being spent, because it's all distributed all around. So for you guys, that makes benefits cases, business cases, very difficult, because there's no big thing to aim at. There was a really interesting observation by, I think it was Rob from CCS, saying that some of the commercial frameworks are part of the solution, but they're not the entire solution. So just because you're on G-Cloud, you still have to go and find the right people to talk to in the local authority to convince them that of the 10 million people on G-Cloud, you're the person they should talk to. So there is a combination of technology problems. Have a solution, have a product or whatever. There's still the people and there's still the process sides to navigate, and those are the really hard bits.
Yeah, Jim Goodley from ThoughtWorks. We had a group of people, some from SMEs, some from local authorities, about 50-50. We wrote down on bits of card our ideas about why councils didn't work together, and then we collected them all together and sort of grouped them. The biggest group that emerged was around just lack of resource, really, that everyone's so heads down delivering on the statutory requirements. There wasn't enough scope to sort of be heads up and saying, oh, could I be collaborating with the next department over there? And that was a really big theme. That was the dominant theme. The next one that kind of came through as a big group was really kind of around risk aversion and sort of trust and all of these things that need to be broken down, that maybe people feel more safe managing their own domain rather than going off and collaborating with lots of other groups. And there was some points about culture. There's a few isolated ones. There was something about how maybe some of the larger vendors don't really encourage working between different councils. There was someone from Bristol who, is he still there? I don't remember your name. Gavin made the point that actually some of this is happening, that we shouldn't be completely down about it. It is something that's kind of occurring, that's going on. And there was a bit of a discussion about leadership, that actually to break the mold and to change, needs a bit of leadership, and then that will then serve as a case study for others, which was quite well received, I think, with the group. And then there was also a point about transparency, in that it's not actually clear that if a council over here is working on 15 projects and a council over here is working on 20 projects, then they can't see what projects each other are working on, and so that scope for collaboration doesn't occur. And so there might be opportunities from forums like this, or maybe other forums, to be more transparent about what the set of projects are, that would then foster more collaboration.
Yeah, so I think we had quite a useful session. I think we essentially touched upon, you know, some of the difficulties maybe there is for SMEs to engage with customers, particularly with such a large number of customers in local government. I think we talked about some of the things that had worked well for people in the past. So we had some examples of where there had been kind of open Dragon's Den style sessions with a number of kind of senior stakeholders from a number of local government customers. We'd sort of looked at those types of methods of engagement, talked about maybe doing a bit more online engagement, so doing speaking to potential customers via WebEx when the cost of travelling down to central London is maybe a little bit too high.
It was about going to the right events with the right people, having the right agendas to make sure the right people show up. So the GAIDAS was held up to be both good and bad in some respects in the past.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, and I think it was about maybe having a broader conversation. I think actually people were doing it already, which I didn't expect. But not just having the technology conversation with IT, but speaking to, like you say, directors of adult social care, for example, if your product addresses that need, or speaking to a finance director if it's going to deal with a budget problem. So I think that those were the types of themes that came out.
So the topic of this was around essentially single view for troubled families, and there were two pieces of technology were presented, both of which take essentially key demographic data extracted as CSV files from all of the different databases across the piece and centralise them and allow them to be searched. One approach had a sort of, I don't know if it was AI, but it was certainly some kind of heuristic matching algorithm that looked pretty cool. The other was based on a sort of pure search where it was left to the human's brain to sort of understand it. The discussion then moved on to the notion that the technology was relatively simple and available. It was actually some of the information governance that went around it was really tricky. And actually that wasn't because of the legislation, because you've got legislation such as the Children's Act of 2004, which allows for and actually compels sharing for safeguarding. It was more around making each information asset owner willing and able to share that data. And there was a discussion about how serious case reviews and some of the reviews, such as the Monroe Review, would kind of made the case for this information sharing, but actually you needed really motivated professionals to drive that from an information governance perspective, who could also articulate the risk back to information asset owners, and that was the real challenge.
Yeah, so Alex was chairing that session, and the discussions were about, the discussion was quite practical, to be fair. We were discussing how the length of certain contracts can be very prohibitive. So let's say SMEs, the Civicas and all the big boys engage in contracts with local authorities that are very kind of long, which can stifle innovation or any drive towards innovation, because they are locked in that contract, but technology doesn't start progressing because you're engaged in some contract. So you might miss out on innovation just because you have long-term commitments. So we were discussing, whether shorter contracts can work. We were discussing something it was kind of bordering the Dragon's Den solution. One of the previous speakers mentioned about how how procurement can be done. Yeah, so it was very. There was not much general discussion. It was all like about practical solutions around contracting structures and how the procurement can be streamlined.
So I try and keep some notes to remember what everybody said. So so we kind of changed the subject a bit to be solving today's challenges with today's solutions. And we used to kind of focus around data integration and data cleansing and presenting data as a kind of fulcrum for the story we wanted to kind of get to grips with. And so how is it that how is it that local authorities can get access to innovative solutions that are coming from other organisations and have been great penetration into private sector and local authorities, public sector at large, keeping a little bit behind that. It's a lot of kind of conversation we had around. So what's the client and how are you telling the story and where do you get the excitement from, and kind of the learning from SMEs. I think a bit around rather than looking at the solution, looking at the benefits. Sounds a bit like you've heard that story before, but I suppose the more that we say it, probably the better that it gets. We talked about trust in supplies being an issue, and the old problem, the kind of catch-22 in local authorities, particularly, that you can't get in till you've been in for a year, and you've sold something and you've got a story to tell. You can't actually break into that, and we're looking at how do you break that cycle a bit. And using ways to use kind of innovation and incubation as incubation hubs and creating something exciting that you can do with a local authority. Particularly, most local authorities have a political requirement to engage with SMEs and to engage with locals, and most authorities can provision some kind of budget to do some innovation. So if you're as a buyer, you want to be in that place where you're creating a budget that allows and stimulates engagement with local SMEs, and as an SME, trying to tap into that conversation and say, so what are your problems? How do you want to solve that? How can we create a new story? Was kind of what we're talking about a bit. We talked a bit about the kind of grumbles to start with. We try to turn it a bit more into so what are the exciting solutions that we might get out of that. We came much back to kind of selling the benefits, innovation incubators as well. There's some conversation about building a virtual council with some virtual citizens in order to then solve some virtual problems and then have a story to tell. Does anyone want to add a bit more to that? I can't remember where that idea came from. That was you, Chris, yeah?
Yeah, it was just the idea that with councils being so risk averse, that if we actually built a virtual world that we could show the solutions working in, that might be a way in.
Way of sort of breaking that old catch-22 problem of can't be there till you're there. Yeah, well, here I am, I have a virtual there. Yeah. So there's some thoughts around that. We also looked at kind of collaboratives and cooperatives, so SMEs banding together. I think part of the problem that public organisations have is you have a kind of due diligence process that you can't buy from a supplier who doesn't have limited liability protection of so many millions. So how do you get up to that level of insurance? So by having collaboratives and cooperatives of SMEs, you can overcome some of that. Back to focusing on the benefits story, understanding the pain point of the organisation. I think you talked about that a bit, Ike, and finding what's the real fulcrum to get into that. And someone suggested actually for an SME to really get noticed in an organisation, pitch up at the local authorities' cabinet meetings, sit there, understand the pain points, meet the cabinet members, talk about the solutions, build a reputation, build a relationship, and then once you've done all that, actually having a conversation with the officers around how to buy something and what have you got might be something. And you had a good example of a supplier who does exactly that, haven't you? Yeah.
Does that work, or does it just piss off the officers?
Chris, your example.
It's important not to fall asleep.
In the supplier that we have doing it at the moment, they are getting the relationship with the members, which is making it easier for when we're putting things forward for approval.
Yeah. So that particular supplier is thought of as part of the local authority.
Yeah. When we've been introduced by members, it's there's been an obligation to look at us, but an unwillingness to accept us.
Okay.
On occasion,
Yeah.
On occasion, not every single time. Obviously, that depends on the relationship between.
Yeah, and to be fair, as a buyer, I've been both sides of that fence. As a buyer, I've found, that elected member who's got his mate, he's got a really good idea that's completely irrelevant to anything I'm trying to do, but because it's a local member, I've got to spend an hour with them talking through a conversation. That's a waste of everybody's time. Yeah. So I think it works when there's authenticity. And there's a genuine solution to a genuine problem, and it fails miserably when there's no authenticity. I don't know if that's your experience as well.
Yeah, it was a genuine solution that we're looking for, and it's built a relationship.
Yeah, you're going to say something on that as well, Joss?
Not.
No, he wasn't. He wasn't.
We've got some time at the end.
Yeah, we're done.
Hello everyone, my name's Mark. So we had the final session, which was a bit of a cathartic self-help group. Really what we were doing is talking about sort of problems in getting in front of a council and how do you nurture that relationship so you actually get a commitment out the back of it. When is there enough evidence to get them to commit? So a couple of examples that we used were to almost take some of the council's existing data and try and show a model of exactly what they may expect going forward, give them an indication of what kind of results they might look for. If that kind of information is available, then you should use that as much as you possibly can.
The FOI point was raised as a way of getting that data?
Yeah. There's, I think we discussed a number of ways that were slightly alternative in getting some credibility and getting in front of people. So FOI requests are obviously one of them. We had one member in the room where they had actually hired a former CEO and essentially as an introducer throughout the council. So they would introduce to other CEOs, not necessarily as part of the final purchaser, but would then flop that person down into the relevant sort of areas that they wanted to talk to. We also talked about sometimes this need where you attach yourself to the one person who's got you into the council and that they're the bastion of your product. If that person is moved on or does something else or whatever it may be, all of a sudden you've lost all of that momentum that you gained. So it's about understanding the network and the decision maker unit within that particular council. So you're not just talking to the person who's brought you in for that initial meeting, that's not just your key contacts, but actually who's the influencers from a IT perspective, from procurement, from legal. Is there other people within the service area that may influence what's going on? Do you know who the director is? Actually, do you see some opportunities across other services as well where you can start that conversation? So if one person is removed or some of that momentum is lost, you have other areas where you can pick that up. We also talked about other influencers as well, external influencers, what they can do for you and how they can get you a lead into the council as well. And the one thing that we came out with is every council thinks it's different. You're unique, just like everybody else. And it's actually the underlying problems are probably quite similar. And we were talking about, where do you have examples? Where we have a great council in London. Oh, well, that's London, that's totally different. Have you got any councils sort of in Scotland? No, but we have some no, well, if it's not north of the border, then we're not really interested. And so breaking down those barriers that, if you can talk about the data and the information and the success that you've actually provided and you've delivered without focusing too much on the geographical location of the council as well, that should help and may help as well. And I think that was pretty much the main of it, right? Oh, and there was one guy with a great product and we all can't understand why it's not done better than it has.